Thank you for joining us today for this Art in the Library's virtual program. I'm Sally Brown, Exhibits Coordinator for WVU Libraries. I am honored to turn this over to Danielle Emmerling, Congressional and Political Papers Archivist and Assistant Curator for the West Virginia and Regional History Center. Welcome, Danielle.
Thanks so much, Sally, and thank you everyone for joining us today to discuss the Equal Rights Amendment. The ERA is almost 100 years old. Original efforts to pass an ERA grew out of the women's suffrage movement. Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman are credited with writing the original text of the ERA, which was introduced in Congress in 1923 for the first time. Almost 50 years later, in 1972, Congress passed the ERA and set a 7-year deadline for ratification. I have to mention that West Virginia ratified the ERA 49 years ago this month on April 22nd, 1972, and was the 16th state to do so. Ratification began at a swift pace, but it slowed as opposition began to organize. In the same time period, 5 states voted to rescind or withdraw their ratification to the ERA. When the ERA did not meet the first deadline, Congress extended it to 1982. And when that deadline passed, the ERA was 3 states shy of the 38 needed for ratification. Over the last few years, the ERA has gained renewed momentum due to the tireless work of advocates and activists. In 2017, it was ratified in the state of Nevada, in 2018 in Illinois, and in 2020, Virginia became the 38th and final state needed to ratify. We are fortunate to be joined today by 3 women who have led contemporary efforts to ratify the ERA. They're going to share their stories about how the ERA got here and help us to better understand where the ERA is headed. Liza Mickens advocates for a more complete narrative of the story of suffrage and the fight for gender equality in America. In addition to representing her family's historical legacy for over a decade, she has been speaking out on gender equality since 2018. She now leads the Vote Equality US intern program. A 2019 graduate from JMU, she has a keen interest in the fashion industry, which she balances with her work to change the world for future generations. Linda Coberly is the chair of Winston & Strawn's Appellate and Critical Motions practice and serves as managing partner of the firm's oldest and largest office. She provides advice on strategic legal issues at all stages of litigation, informed by her time as a clerk for Justice Stephen G. Breyer and for Judge Douglas H. Ginsburg on the DC Circuit. She has argued more than 50 appeals in federal and state appellate courts across the country. Ms. Coberly serves as chair of the ERA Coalition's legal task force and leads the firm's pro bono efforts to support ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. She is a director and immediate past chair of the board of Heartland Alliance, the Midwest's largest human rights and anti-poverty organization, serves on the board of the United Way for Metro Chicago, and is vice president of the board of trustees of Chicago's Goodman Theater, and is a member of the Chicago Network, an organization of women at the top of their organizations in business, law, academia, government, and the arts. She holds an AB from Princeton and a JD from the University of Michigan. And Jerry Burton, who is a lifelong progressive activist. She currently is president of the Nevada chapter of the National Organization for Women, NOW, serves on the NOW National Board representing the Western region, and is the chair of the NOW's 28th Amendment ERA Committee. It is my pleasure to turn over the presentation to Liza Mickens.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for having me. I'm just gonna share my screen really quickly. Okay. So I am Liza Mickens. I am here on behalf of Vote Equality US. I was born and raised in Richmond, Virginia, and I graduated from JMU in 2019, go Dukes. And that is when I became involved with VA Ratify ERA, which is what Vote Equality emerged out of. But the efforts in Virginia to make sure that we would be the 38th state to ratify. I'm also the great-great-granddaughter of Maggie Walker, who was a suffragist in her own regard, and really an forgotten suffragist or under-highlighted suffragist, born in 1864 in Richmond, Virginia. She was a part of the first generation of freedom. So the first generation of African Americans we're seeing after the Civil War. The first generation learning how to read and write and establish a sense of self-sufficiency. And she was a teacher and valued education. But after only 3 years of teaching, due to societal norms, once she got married, she had to quit her job and was forced to stay at home. And she really took this time to pour her work into the church and to the Independent Order of St. Luke, which is a benevolent society like the True Reformers that we see emerge during Reconstruction, again, to aid Blacks into the transition of becoming citizens in America. And they offered insurance, loans, funeral costs, and it is through the Independent Order that Maggie becomes and rises to prominence. In 1895, she establishes a juvenile division, because once you're a teacher at heart, you realize the importance of education and you realize the importance of youth. And she establishes this just a few years after her son dies at just 7 months. And so she really does use this as a way to deal with her grief. And again, realizing that if children are involved, inevitably their parents are going to also have to be involved. So in 1899, the organization was really teetering on bankruptcy, and no man stepped up to the job, but they didn't need a man, they needed Maggie. And she became the right worthy Grand Secretary, which was the highest position in the order at the time. So in this new leadership role, she establishes the St. Luke Herald to make sure that people in Richmond are aware of what is happening in their city in terms of racial uplift, as well as other ways to get involved in the community. And with any sort of grassroots work, there needs to be a way to get the word out. And that was the St. Luke Herald for her. And then in 1903, she establishes the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank, which makes her the first African-American woman to found, charter, and serve as president of a bank in America. And this is her most notable title in American history, and largely what she is remembered for. And in 1905, she also establishes the St. Luke Emporium. And through this, she becomes the largest employer of Black women in the city of Richmond. Everything that Maggie Walker did was primarily staffed by women, because she recognized that while the race was struggling during Reconstruction, it was Black women who were facing a double-edged sword of oppression. They were facing systematic inequalities and systematic racism, but they were also facing the institution of the patriarchy. So she really used her work to uplift women, and through this became, became a suffragist. When the 19th Amendment was passed, she registered to vote, and then she registered hundreds of Black women in the city of Richmond to vote as well. And she didn't stop there. She ran for political office just 1 year later as the superintendent of education, continuing to honor her roots. She ran on the Lily Black ticket with other contemporaries from Richmond like John Mitchell, and this was in direct response to the Lily White Republican ticket. Like I said, everything that Maggie Walker did was primarily for African American women, and to make sure that her gender was being uplifted. She was a feminist, I feel like, before they really even called it feminism. But in the tale of the Equal Rights Amendment and in this history of suffrage, it has been seemingly, like most of American history, really whitewashed. And people like Maggie Walker are forgotten for their contributions. And when I got involved with VA Ratify ERA back in 2018, it was really to change the narrative on the suffrage movement, and through extension, the history of the ERA, to make sure that it was fully inclusive. Previously, most people my age, I was not aware of the Equal Rights Amendment. Truly, it is a large generational educational gap in ERA knowledge since the really second wave of feminism and the efforts we saw in the 70s. When those efforts stalled, in some regards, the education around the issue stalled as well. So I was really excited to be able to learn about this issue, but then be able to begin advocating for it as well. And then in 2020, my state, Virginia, became the 38th and final state needed for ratification, sending it back to Congress, where there is still work to be done, particularly in the Senate. But the ERA just simply ensures equality of rights under the law, regardless of sex. Currently, 168 other international constitutions guarantee gender equality, and the US is not one of those countries. We're no longer in the top third when it comes to gender equality. And truthfully, our statistics are just staggering in the other direction. And I think that in this year, with everything else, the pandemic has only heightened the issues. It's only heightened the gender equality and pay gap, but it's also seen the most women leave the workforce in ways that we've never seen before. So going forward, having these conversations and realizing how many inequalities there are in every sphere of American life, it's so important that we really dismantle these barriers and really establish a more equal and just society so that we can live up to the creed of being Americans, to ensure that there is liberty and justice for all. And these issues, were here before the pandemic began, but it's really on us to try and make substantive changes in our society. And through the Equal Rights Amendment, a lot of changes can be made. So vote equality, like I said, emerged from the group that worked to ratify the ERA in Virginia. And we are a nonpartisan grassroots effort. And I think that that is super important to highlight because both political parties historically have championed the Equal Rights Amendment, and now it's really time to come together, recognize the history, and move forward collectively to make sure that this is a constitutional tenet. And so our overall mission at the end of the day is voter education and voter outreach. And so we've accomplished this through various programming and initiatives. This past fall, we led the Notorious RVG Tour, so a tour through the southern states to engage and educate voters and really encourage participation and making sure that people are aware of the Equal Rights Amendment. Again, making sure that it is a part of conversation and that it was a part of the conversation leading into the election. This bus was obviously in honor of the late Notorious RBG, who was a champion for constitutional gender equality. And it really acted as a moving billboard throughout the South, a source for a lot of questions. But that's great because questions lead to conversations. And it actually went back down for the Georgia runoff to amplify the local grassroots efforts there, making sure that people were turning out the vote in the same way that they did in the regular election. And then we also like to engage in craftivism and make sure that, people are doing what they want to do and really highlighting their own creativity on the issue. And craftivism is not just political art, but more so a call to action. So these clocks were created for state senators specifically from their constituents in each state to signify, one, that there is no deadline on equality, which is something we're going to discuss through this programming, but also to make sure that they realize that the time is now for the Equal Rights Amendment and for equality to really be the law of the land. So currently we are also doing a programming targeted towards college age students. We're doing an essay contest to make sure that the youth and that our voice is a part of this issue because it is the future that we one day will inherit. So it is important that our voices are heard on this issue, and more than anything, that we are aware that this is an issue, that this is something that is not yet in our Constitution. So I definitely encourage any college-age students to go check out our website and think about what you want to say about gender equality and why we need a more equal and just future. I would also just be remiss if I didn't shout out the team. So Vote Equality is led by our fearless leader, Katie Hornung, who was the person that got me involved in VA Ratify ERA. She is the best person to learn about grassroots efforts from, because she has really a great idea of what equality is supposed to be. At the end of the day, if your equality isn't intersectional, that isn't equality, right? We all have to have a seat at the table, and we all have to be a part of demanding equality for our future. And particularly, again, people my age, it's so important for us to be a part of the conversations for the future that we're going to inherit. And so I'm really lucky to be able to work with our team of interns. These are some of our interns. And it's great to make sure that we are continuing the fight, right? To make sure that we are aware of this issue and carry on the baton as we seemingly change the world. But this group is really great in advocating and making sure that their friends are engaged on the issue. So I encourage also any young people in this group here today to walk away from this and educate your roommates. I remember being in college not very long ago. And, you know, the conversations that you have with the people around you are so important and so substantive in beginning to make change. So really recognize the power of your voice in these conversations. With that, you know, there is a real opportunity to make change in this country. And the pandemic has highlighted it. It's been talked about a lot, but the conversation can't end here. You know, you have to contact your senators. You have to be involved in elections. There is, you know, so much that we can do, and we have to realize that our voice matters, and that we are the future. So I will say that you should definitely follow us on social media. Check out our website for other programming, because there are so many ways to be involved in this issue. And like we're realizing with everything else in the pandemic, there's so much you can do just from your home. So going forward, we have to work to close the gender equality gap, but also close the generational educational gap around the Equal Rights Amendment. And I'm so happy to be here and be able to talk a little bit more about this with the other incredible panelists. So with that, I turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liza. We're very happy you're here too. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Linda Coberly. Have to unmute.
I'm working on sharing my screen as well, so bear with me just a second. And I'm going to share with you some information about where we are currently with the ERA. So you heard the history earlier, and in terms of our current status, you're looking at it on the screen right now. What I've shown you is a map of all the states in dark green that have ratified the ERA. And in light green, you have the states that have most recently ratified, along with their dates of ratification. I sit in Illinois, in Chicago, and was happy and really thrilled to be part of the effort to ratify the ERA in Chicago, and in Illinois. Our firm got involved in that process in 2017, and it was shortly after the ratification in Nevada. Our senior chairman, who is not a terribly progressive person, he's a traditional guy, and he was and he hadn't really been engaged in this process before, but he was listening to NPR on the way to work one day and heard the story of the ratification in Nevada. And when listening to that story, learned that Illinois had not yet ratified. As Liza mentioned, a lot of people think the ERA either have never thought about the ERA or actually believe it's already in the Constitution. They think it's something that happened in the 1970s and then ended. And so one of our tasks as advocates is to try to raise awareness over that. And that's the kind of awareness that the chairman of my firm acquired that day listening to the story on NPR. And he called me to his office and he said, we need to get involved in this. As a Chicago-born law firm. And I said, sign me up. And so that was the beginning of my work on the ERA. It was getting people within our firm organized and connecting with the advocates in the state of Illinois who'd been working on ratification for many years. And it was really one of the great thrills of my life to be watching the hearing in which Illinois became the 37th state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. So there are a couple of issues, as you might guess, standing in the way of the ERA, and I'm going to share with you what those issues are and how they work from a legal perspective. The first, to start with though, let's start with the process of, here, I need to somehow advance, there we go, advance my slides. So, just to give you an overview of the process for ratifying the Constitution. It is really hard to change an amendment or change the Constitution. It's really hard to add an amendment. The process is set out in the fifth article, and Article 5 says the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states. So this is really difficult. There's two ways to propose an amendment. One is through the Congress, and that's what I have quoted here on the screen. The other is through a constitutional convention, and we haven't had one of those since the beginning. So the way the ERA was proposed was that Congress voted on it. It actually passed with overwhelming majorities in both houses and was extremely popular across the board. And you heard the history. There were a lot of ratifications very quickly after it was sent to the states. And then the support for the ERA became more complicated in the late 1970s. And we ended up with a time limit passing with only 35 states having ratified. So let's talk about that time limit. What you're looking at on your screen is the actual text of the Equal Rights Amendment as it was approved by Congress. The portion that would actually become part of the Constitution is at the bottom. It says article. And you see there the three sections of the ERA that are actually part of the amendment. And that first section is the one that people put on t-shirts and talk about all the time. And that's equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Section 2 is part of the ERA that we don't hear about as much, but that I think is just as important. And that's a section that gives more power to Congress to legislate in ways that would be protective of women and sexual minorities to protect their rights. So Section 2 of the ERA actually expands the power of Congress in an important way. And it is actually that section that I think is the most important in terms of really changing the law for the better. And then Section 3 just puts a 2-year delay on the effectiveness of the amendment. And I'll get back to that in a second. Now, the text you see above the word article is what we call the preamble. And this was part of the joint resolution that Congress actually voted on. And as you heard before, it includes a 7-year time limit on ratification. It says that this amendment will be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution when ratified within 7 years from the date of its submission by the Congress. That 7-year time limit wasn't really a new idea in 1972 when this was passed. Every amendment, or most of the amendments proposed in the United States since women's suffrage have had a 7-year time limit in some fashion. The early ones actually had the seven-year time limit in the text of the article itself, so below where you currently see the word article. In the 1960s, the practice became to put the 7-year time limit in the text of the preamble. We've actually never had a situation before where there was a 7-year time limit and there were ratifications up to 3/4 of the states that occurred after a time limit expired. So we're in a very unprecedented situation right now. But the placement of the time limit for the ERA ends up mattering quite a bit. And the reason is that, because the time limit is in the part of the joint resolution that the states aren't voting on, it's in the preamble. That means that Congress should be able to change it after the fact. And Congress did actually change the time limit already once when it, in the late 1970s, adopted a 3-year extension. It voted by simple majority in Congress to move the time limit deadline so that it expired in 1982. Now, unfortunately, there were no additional ratifications between 1979 and 1982, so it ended up not mattering. But there are, as I'll mention in a second, there are efforts in Congress today to remove the time limit from this joint resolution, just remove it altogether. That measure has actually passed in the House and is now awaiting a Judiciary Committee hearing in the Senate. So this is the first big issue. It's the time limit. What do we do with that 7-year time limit that exists in the preamble to the ERA? There's another issue, which is called the rescissions. And there are 5 states that voted in the 1970s to either limit or revoke their prior ratifications. It's actually now North Dakota is joining the ranks of this group just recently. Now, taking back a rescission is not something that the Constitution provides for. Under the Constitution, a state legislature has only one job, and that is to ratify or not. And once a state has ratified, there is no process for taking the ratification back. And so the argument of ERA advocates is that the rescissions don't matter. That the only thing that matters is that the original ratification by each of these states on the dates that you note here. And the best historical precedent for this is with the 14th Amendment, actually. The 14th Amendment became part of the Constitution at a time when 2 of the necessary states had ratified and then voted to take it back later. And yet those 2 states were included in the list of states to ratify the amendment, and all 3 branches of the federal government treated the ERA as valid and part of the Constitution. So it's a pretty powerful historical precedent for the idea that once a state ratifies an amendment, it can't take that ratification back. So there's no role for the executive branch of the federal government in the amendment process, but there is a statute that calls for the National Archivist to publish the amendment. Basically, the National Archivist, the archivist of the National Archives, which you may think of as, the person who keeps the original Declaration of Independence and who manages the presidential libraries and who has important documents kept in archive for the public to view. The National Archivist has another job, which is to basically be the person who keeps track of the ratifications by the states. He literally receives the mail, the ratifications official notice that comes to him from the states, and counts them up. And when there are enough ratifications to satisfy Article 5 of the Constitution, he is required to publish the amendment as part of the Constitution. So the archivist hasn't done that. And the reason he hasn't done that is because the Department of Justice under the Trump administration took the position that because of the time limit, the ERA is not valid and the later ratifications don't count. The last 3 ratifications don't count because they all came after the time limit. And with that instruction, the archivist concluded that he would not publish the amendment, even though we've now reached 38 states. So to get past, to kind of deal with the time limit issue, there was a lawsuit filed. There actually have been a total of 3 lawsuits filed. The first one was filed in Alabama, and it was filed by 3 conservative states, including one.
Just want to get some confirmation that you can hear me okay. Someone give me the.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think you may be on the wrong. So the lawsuit filed by the 3 conservative states was filed to force the National Archivist not to publish the amendment when Virginia ratified. Those 3 states knew that Virginia was about to ratify, and so they filed this lawsuit to stop the publication of the amendment. And it was then that the archivist asked the Department of Justice, what should I do? And the Department of Justice said, we agree you shouldn't publish the amendment. The other 2 lawsuits were filed to do the opposite, to force the archivist to publish the amendment. They have both been dismissed now for different reasons, but the basic argument that was being made in those 2 lawsuits was that the time limit in the preamble to the joint resolution isn't effective. It doesn't do anything. It's not effective to change the process in Article 5, which simply says that an amendment becomes valid when it is ratified by 3/4 of the states. So the argument in these lawsuits is that the ERA is valid today, despite the presence of the time limit, because that time limit just doesn't do anything. It can't change the process for amending the Constitution. As of this moment, that the first case was dismissed voluntarily, and the second 2 cases were dismissed by the courts for different reasons, mostly having to do with whether the plaintiffs in those states actually had the power to sue in federal court. But the third lawsuit, the one brought by Virginia, Illinois, and Nevada, was also dismissed on the ground that the time limit is there, it is effective, and can only be removed by Congress, not by the courts. So that lawsuit really kicks the issue back to Congress to try to take some action to remove the time limit. And the court very specifically didn't address any issue having to do with whether Congress has the power to remove the time limit today. So that brings us to the legislation. This is the language of the legislation that is pending in Congress right now. It simply says that notwithstanding any time limit contained in the original joint resolution, the article of amendment proposed to the states in that joint resolution shall be valid whenever ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states. So what it really accomplishes is it makes clear that it is Article 5 and the process in Article 5 that will govern when the amendment becomes valid, not the preamble of the joint resolution from 1972. This slide is out of date. The joint resolution in the House was passed a short time ago by the U.S. House of Representatives, and it's now pending in the Senate. It's co-sponsored by Senators Murkowski and Cardin. It does have bipartisan support, although, as you might guess, by a narrow thread. And so that's where a lot of advocacy is going to be needed to move the ERA forward. So that's what I have for you. I'm happy to answer some questions as we go forward, and I'll turn it back to our moderator.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you for clarifying some of those legal issues for us. It's now my pleasure to turn this over to Jerry Burton.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. I can join you here virtually from Nevada. It's nice. It's wonderful to hear. I learn every time from Linda Coverly and Liza what they're doing in Virginia, and that it struck me that I'm from Nevada, and we've got Illinois and Virginia, the 3 most recent ratified states. So you did a good job with your speakers on that. So thank you for inviting me today. I wanted to start off, my friend and fellow ERA activist Zoe Nicholson used to start her women's studies classes off by handing her copy of the Constitution to female students and asking them to find women in the Constitution. And of course, women aren't mentioned. So it was written by white men who own land, who did not think about women or people of color when they said, "We the people of the United States." So we've been working on fixing the Constitution to include women ever since. Young women, as we've heard from Liza as well, often ask how they can get involved. And most recently, I've heard they've watched the movie Mrs. America and realized they're not in the Constitution. So it's important for young women and young people to get involved. They're the ones who'll be most impacted by the Equal Rights Amendment. And we feel that 2021 is the year for the ERA. As you've heard, there's a lot of work to be done. So we talked a little bit about it, but in 1923, Alice Paul first introduced the ERA after her work for all those years on the 19th Amendment for the women's vote. And it was introduced in every session of Congress until it finally passed in 1972. But there was a representative, Emanuel Seller of New York, who had refused to hold a hearing for over 30 years. And I want to have you have a sense of the theme here of it being stopped by men all these years. In 1970, two women in Congress, Representative Martha Griffiths and Representative Shirley Chisholm, pressed to make it a top legislative priority. And in March 1972, it passed in both chambers with bipartisan support, as we talked about, and then sent to the states for ratification. So I was happy to hear that West Virginia was the 16th state. My state of Nevada was the 36th. So I want to give you a little history about how it started up again. It languished after several of the states had ratified, and everyone thought that was it. And in 2014, Jeanette Dean, she's an activist, she was an activist at the University of Nevada, Reno, studying political science and psychology or sociology. She learned, as a lot of young women do, that she was not in the Constitution and that Nevada had not ratified. And she went and met with State Senator Pat Spearman, asking her to carry the bill to ratify. So Senator Spearman agreed to do it. And she told people, as she does with everything she takes on, "I'm not going to give up. So, stick with me." And we did. The Nevada activists were with her for the long haul and still are. It didn't pass in 2015, the first time she carried the bill, but then we did what Senator Spearman advised. We elected people who would support equality, just like they did in Virginia. It passed easily in 2017 after those elections. And then, as we've heard, Illinois in 2018, and as Liza said, Virginia in 2020, using a very similar strategy. And since then, in Nevada, we've gone on to elect the first female majority legislature, which in turn meant passing progressive legislation. We just passed our own state ERA, so we didn't have the ERA in our own constitution in Nevada. It just passed in our legislative session, and it'll now go onto the ballot in 2022. So, and if ever you want to be inspired, first of all, anytime you want to be inspired, listen to Senator Spearman, but she has a speech that she made recently for the Nevada State ERA. Grab a tissue and watch it. I've heard her speak probably 50 times on the ERA, and this was the most impassioned. And just a couple of things she said was, "I was born equal. The ERA does not say this is the only way you can be equal. What we're saying in the ERA is to recognize my equality." And then she said, "If you can comprehend what it means to have to fight every day of your life to be recognized as equal, if you understand that, you know why we should vote yes." So one of the important results of what happened in Nevada was electing more women, and the type of legislation changed and the tone of the legislature changed. So women in the legislature are reporting less sexual harassment. We have period products free in bathrooms in the Capitol. We passed paid leave, equal pay and minimum wage bills, to name many. We did last session and this session, what we're working on. So electing women meant half of the population is represented, and we're showing in Nevada that it's made a difference. So my chapter, Nevada Now, became involved when we worked to help pass the ERA. And then we knew we had to continue to support other states that were unratified. So as the Now's 28th Amendment Committee Chair and as Nevada Now State President, we worked with Arizona and Utah and Virginia Now chapters and activists to help ratify in their states. We've done things like raise money and make calls and write letters, but we also adopted some candidates in Virginia to help do what Nevada did and elect equality champions. I spent a week in Virginia helping Virginia Now activists on campaigns, and I went to Utah and Arizona for their women's marches, working on their tables to educate people on the ERA, which is so important. So anyway, so now we have the 38 state needed to publish the ERA, as Linda was talking about the legal parts of it. But it turns out that our work has just begun. And it struck me this morning how much we need West Virginia activists to get involved to make this happen. It turns out West Virginia senators and activists are going to be key to putting women in the Constitution and moving forward the legislation that can help the country recover from the crisis that the pandemic has caused. So you know your state best. I just know if it was Nevada senators holding up the Equal Rights Amendment and some of this legislation, I'd do everything I could to convince them. So one of the things we need to do is to ask President Biden and Congress to make ERA a priority. Again, with Senator Spearman, she said the other day we were working on an equal pay bill to enhance the one we already passed. And she said, you know, if we had the ERA, we wouldn't need this. So you've heard the next steps with the legal action. Our Attorney General, Aaron Ford, is involved with that third case. But activists around the country are needed to bring attention. We need Congress and the Senate to remove the timeline placed in the preamble. Alice Paul cried when she heard about the changes in the wording that included that timeline, that deadline, and she was correct to worry. But we feel if Congress can add it and extend it, they can remove it. So we need your actions to help ask your senators to co-sponsor. So the bill in the Senate is SJ Res 1 to remove the deadline, the timeline. The House, as we said, passed in HJ Res 17 in March, and there were 4 Republicans that voted for it. So that was bipartisan. And it heads to the Senate, but we really have a tougher path there. The reality is we need 60 votes, or we need to remove the filibuster. And then some are saying we have to do the start over bill. Representative Maloney has a bill to start the process over, but we don't want women to wait another 100 years to be in the Constitution. So I just know so many people who spent their entire lives working on this, and we don't want to start over. So I'm with NOW, and NOW has been working on this for over 50 years. And our committee has been working on some different actions. Abby Davis, who's from Virginia now, gave us an idea for a graphic to be an ERA activist. And it includes writing signing a petition to Biden and Harris, thanking them for their support. They both expressed support for the ERA and are moving the timeline in their campaigns. We need to ask them to make it a priority. And as we talked about with the archivist, we don't know if they've got, a lot of people say they don't have any influence on what the archivist does, but it doesn't hurt for activists to ask for him to publish it and to ask Biden to work on that. So as Linda said, you know, that Nevada and Illinois, both, the archivist published both of those states and now won't publish Virginia. So there's precedent there for sure. So we came up with the idea of having a visual action. We've been raising money to send masks, ERA Yes masks to, and I think they're going to put up a graphic about it, but and we have a graphic there for your senator. So I always have my ERAS mask handy. We've been raising money to send it to President Biden, to Vice President Harris, to Congress, the Senate, and to the media, and asking them to wear their masks as a show of support, and asking them to support the bills to remove the timeline. One of our committee members is Zoe Nicholson that I mentioned before. She's an ERA activist who fasted for 36 days with 7 women in 1982 to bring attention to the Illinois ratifying. And she is hand making the masks. She's made over 800. Some for our fundraiser. We have that for every mask you buy, $5 goes towards our project to fund it. And we sent 220 congressional masks to supporters of HJ Res 17 to the Democrats. And we sent them to their home offices, and because of all the security in DC, and it worked. If in the middle of that graphic, you can see that Jackie Spear and Carolyn Maloney, among probably 6 or 7 other of the Congress people, were wearing the masks when they voted, and it was so exciting. And then the media covered it, and the pictures were, showing them with our masks. So it was a really good visual way to bring attention to the ERA. And we now are sending them to the 50 of them to the Senate Democrats, and then 10 to Republican senators that we feel have a chance to be co-sponsors to get the 60 votes needed in the Senate. So this is the graphic that we made for Joe Manchin. We're asking activists, we made one for every one of the states, and asking activists to use this graphic on social media, to tweet it, to post it on Facebook, or use it as an email, and tell them to watch for his mask and ask them to co-sponsor SJ Res 1. And we'll be sending one to Shelley Moore Capito, if I'm saying that right, to ask for her support. And we'll have a graphic for that as well. So you can find it on our Now 28th Facebook page, or you can email me at jerry@nevadanow.org. We also have some free postcards on our Nevada Now website that can be printed that you could use to write to your senators. In Nevada, because we're a small state, groups can easily meet with senators, especially now virtually. So maybe call and make an appointment and tell them how important this is for you. Make your calls, make your emails, use this graphic for an action. We really need West Virginia to get engaged. I plan on working with West Virginia Now to really start focusing on getting this done. I think West Virginia is now a key point for us in activism, and we need you to educate people about the ERA and then find ways to get involved. We've waited we can't wait another 100 years for this to happen, and we could use your help. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jerry. And thanks also for highlighting the importance of electing more women. So I'd like to, at this point, open it up for audience questions. I see a couple have already been put in the chat. You can also feel free to unmute yourself to ask a question. I see that we have one question from AJ in the chat, and I think, Linda, this might be for you. What's the deadline to appeal for the AG lawsuit?
Because the government's involved, the AGs have 60 days from the ruling to appeal. And so that the time will be up at the beginning of May. So the time hasn't passed yet. One other thing I want to say about the lawsuits, though, is that whether they're, and that decision will be made by the Attorney General's offices, but whether there's an appeal or not, one thing I know for sure is that one decision by the DC District Court is not going to be the last word on the issue of the effectiveness of the timeline. Beginning next January, it will be when that 2-year waiting period, remember I mentioned earlier, there's a 2-year delay in the effectiveness of the ERA provisions once it becomes part of the Constitution. So beginning 2 years after the ratification by Virginia, or January 2022, we will begin to see lawsuits filed by people who are asserting claims under the Equal Rights Amendment. People who say that the government discriminated against them in some way in violation of the first clause of the Equal Rights Amendment. In those cases, the defendant in the case, which will probably be a state or a municipality or something, will probably argue that the ERA isn't really part of the Constitution because of the time limit. So in those cases, the courts will have to contend with this argument about whether a time limit in a preamble to an amendment is really effective to stand in the way of an amendment for which there have been 38 ratifications. So that's the issue that the district court has already resolved in Washington, D.C., but I imagine there will be additional courts weighing in on that issue starting in January of next year.
Thank you. I also wanted to point out that Beth has shared some links in the chat that relate to Jerry's work with Nevada Now, so that you can access some of that information she was sharing. And then Jerry also shared a link to where you can get your own ERA mask and support their actions. So those are in the chat. Amanda says that she would love to know if Manchin and Capito have a clock regarding the ERA, and we'll certainly be pushing them to wear the ERA mask and support the SJR for ERA.
So I would say we did a call out for clocks maybe back in March and had a great response. But that does not mean that you can't, as an individual, also reach out to them and send them things to continue to encourage them. There's nothing that compares to actually hearing from constituents. So pairing that clock with a letter as well of support and why this matters to you is super important.
Thanks, Liza. And Liza, there's a question for you actually from someone who'd like to hear more about the statue of Maggie, and the bar that she set for the important work that you're doing.
I feel like if I accomplish even a 16th of everything Maggie Walker was able to do, I will have lived a good life. But she truly was a force to be reckoned with, and a woman I admire greatly because there was no blueprint, right? I think that now we realize how important representation is and how important it is to have somebody to look up to. And it's great that Maggie Walker is that sort of beacon for a lot of women of color and women in general. But when we think back to it, you know, she was born in the former capital of the Confederacy and at a time when Richmond was destroyed because of the Civil War, and really used that rebuilding to also build up her race. And so where her statue is in Richmond is actually just a few blocks away from where her emporium was on Broad Street, which is really significant because Broad Street was notorious for being a primarily white shopping zone. And, you know, Black customers couldn't even walk through the front door. If they could, they weren't ever allowed to try on clothing. And, you know, Maggie Walker restored a sense of dignity to the shopping experience. She featured brown skin mannequins, but like I said, used that and became the largest employer of Black women. So her statue is right where we feel it needs to be. There have been obviously a lot of conversations around Richmond monuments in the past year, and Maggie stands right at the gateway of Jackson Ward, and purposefully not on Monument Avenue because we feel that she is best watching over her neighborhood and where she left so much of an impact. I do see this question here asking if she worked specifically on the ERA, and I can't say that she worked specifically on the ERA. During Maggie Walker's life, actually, she became paralyzed due to diabetes. So by the end of her life, she was completely confined to a wheelchair. And that didn't limit anything that she was able to accomplish, but she definitely prioritized her focus on making sure that Black women were registered to vote and making sure that they recognized the power of getting out their vote more broadly than just the ERA specifically. But it doesn't mean that she didn't fight for the same principles that we're still fighting for now.
Thank you, Liza. Well, while we wait for some more questions from our audience, I would like to ask a question. It seems to me that opposition to the ERA in the 70s was kind of focused on specific issues that the ERA might affect, but now the opposition seems to say, well, we don't really need it, right? Women have achieved equality, it's just symbolic. So to all of our speakers, I ask, is the ERA symbolic?
Well, I'll take that to start with, and then I know my co-panelists will have something to say about it too. First of all, let's start with the idea of symbolism. Why is that a reason to vote against the ERA? The late Justice Ginsburg, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, was a huge proponent of the ERA. And one of the things she said was, some people say it's just symbolic, but even if that were true, it's a really important symbol. And as Liza explained earlier, every constitution written in the world since World War II, and the United States played a role in all of those constitutions, has an equal rights guarantee in it. And it's just a non-discrimination guarantee. If it's really not that big a deal and we already have it, then why not put it in the Constitution? Something else is going on there. So that's the first thing. Second, it's not just symbolic. First of all, as I mentioned, that Section 2 is really important. As you might remember from your civics classes, our Congress has limited powers, and it can only do what the Constitution expressly gives it the right to do. And most of what Congress does today, it does under its commerce power, its power over interstate commerce. But there are certain kinds of things that are just too far afield from commerce, and therefore Congress doesn't really have the power to do that. And so you sometimes see court challenges to congressional action that goes a little bit too far away from commerce. For example, there was a statute that made it a federal crime to commit FGM, or female genital mutilation. A federal judge in Michigan a couple of years ago declared that statute unconstitutional, not because he thought it was a good idea to do female genital mutilation, and actually that is illegal in most states anyway, but because he concluded that the federal statute on that topic was too disconnected from interstate commerce to be within the power of Congress to enact. The second section of the Equal Rights Amendment would give Congress an alternative basis for power to enact legislation that is designed to prevent discrimination against women and girls and really anyone on the basis of sex. And this is another really important thing, particularly in light of the decision by the Supreme Court in Bostock last year, which many of you may have heard of. The Supreme Court held by a significant majority that the language on the basis of sex includes discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and trans status. And as we all know, the trans community, which is very small in this country, but still really in need of legal protection, is under an unprecedented attack in state legislatures today. There are bills pending in many state legislatures to prevent trans high school students from competing in sports. And the legislators in those states are often asked, how many trans athletes in your state are actually competing in sports? And how many, the usual argument is that women are hurt when trans women compete because the trans women have an advantage. The idea is a physical advantage. When asked, is that really a problem? Like, how many trans women are actually competing in high school sports, and how many cis women have actually been disadvantaged? The answer is practically none. Like, this is a solution in search of a problem. And yet it has real consequences for young people who are getting the message from their state legislatures that they are not human beings. This is a really important issue, and the ERA would help. And so that's one really concrete area where advocacy for the ERA can help all people and prevent them from being discriminated against based on things that have to do with the accident of their sex. So I think there's a lot of ways in which the ERA would be important for real people in the world today.
Thank you, Linda. I want to give Liza or Jerry, if there's anything you'd like to add, a chance to jump in.
I was just going to reiterate again that when I'm working with Senator Spearman on bills in Nevada, she often says if the ERA was in place, then we could, sue for equal pay and sue for paid leave and the things that women need. And also, once again, our women are just not named in the Constitution. So that just is an obvious thing that needs to happen. Liza?
Oh, you're muted.
I would just reiterate again that, the Constitution is symbolic for a reason, and it is important that it, mentions for liberty and justice for all, but we recognize who was written when that was stated. And we've seen amendments put in place to protect the rights of all Americans. And, that same protection should be extended to women and non-binary people as well in this country.
Thank you, Liza. Well, thank you to all of our presenters. I think we're just about at time, so I'm going to throw this back to Sally.
Thank you so much, everyone. This has been very enlightening. We have a survey Beth just posted, in the chat, and I will be emailing the survey link again, as well as the links that were mentioned in the chat for everybody to have here in a day or two. And yes, thank you everybody so much for coming, and
thank you again. Yeah, thank you again, Jerry, Liza, and Linda. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day, everybody.